And I've actually been on a drive. Someone will say, I'll drive and blindfold you. They actually did in Florida, blindfolded me on a case. A blindfold doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm not using anything visual like they're thinking. So I was, they blindfolded me and I'd say, I feel like I'm coming up to a road on my left, turn left. Okay, I want you to go down about 3 miles. Okay, I'm feeling something, again, turn left. And it takes me right to the spot. I seem to pick up a lot doing that. And I really feel it's as if the whole thing is playing out almost like a movie in some way as I'm going through. And I don't hear, I've had actually people say, I kept saying your name and talking to you and you're not listening. I'm like, I get in my zone when I'm doing it.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
So welcome to a really special edition of Surviving the Survivor, because we're looking at something most people don't look at, but could be really important when it comes to true crime. A couple of quick things. First off, you'll notice cardboard cutout Carm is the real thing. She has decided to join us here. When she's not here, we have a cardboard cutout. And as both of you learned very quickly as I was adjusting this set, it is a tremendous amount of work. I am doing interviews. I'm sending out Zoom invites. I'm redesigning the set. And so if you would like to support the podcast, you can go to Patreon and search for Surviving the Survivor. We would greatly appreciate a little support to keep up all the things that are necessary in this podcast and keeping it going. And I forgot what a pleasure it is to have my beautiful mother commenting as I go.
Do you want to help my son? His company, Content Partners Media, specializes in brand video and content creation for innovative companies and others. Please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com and hire him. I repeat, please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com.
Carmela, you are a licensed therapist. You spent 40 years, you have a degree in social work.
A master's
degree. You think sometimes that you are a FBI criminal profiler, but you're not. But you play one, or you think you're one. But we've covered some really major cases. Obviously, the quadruple homicides in Idaho, and we are covering extensively the Dan Markel murder case out of Florida, the FSU professor who was shot twice in the head, and it turns out it was a pair of hitmen, and now the family is involved, and the ex-brother-in-law is going on trial. Typically, we speak to criminal defense attorneys. We do speak to FBI profilers. We speak to people who study serial killers. Someone we have not talked to, who are used frequently to solve crimes, are psychics. And you see two of them on the screen right now. Up above is Nancy Orlen Weber. I'm going to give a very brief bio of her. She was a nurse for a really long time, a medical intuitive, an animal communicator, psychic, medium, and more. She became interested back, I'm not going to date her, but I guess this will, back in the 1960s in all things holistic and the environmental effects on us and the planet. She is also into the study of homeopathy, herbalism, tinctures, and applied kinesiology, all of which we'll get into. And below you in the red is Gale St. from Toledo, Ohio, the heartland. She describes herself as a somewhat shy woman raised in a psychic family with her mother and maternal grandparents practicing psychic and spiritual beliefs. She's been doing this since she was a child and has appeared on shows like Larry King Live, Nancy Grace, May Larry Rest in Peace, Psychic Detectives on Court TV, and many other shows. And just before we get going, Gale, I know you were out today searching. That's another avocation or vocation of yours with your canine. What is that all about before we get into the world of psychics?
I had trained canines and did competition work from the time I was young on. And then I said, while I'm out doing this, maybe I should learn more. about training canines, getting involved in search and rescue. I'm not quite sure in the beginning that I knew what I was getting into. And then I went full time into search and rescue, going to back to school, having to learn more, having to do more things, not just training your own canine, but going through emergency medical, doing all these other things. I didn't realize it was going to be a 5-year endeavor in the beginning, just going to school. Missions such as the hurricanes, mudslides, things that happen, to just everyday police needing, like say, human remains detection canine come out. We've got a situation, you've got to come out. And so there's so much community need. I just dove into that, and here I am 30 years later, still doing it.
Carmela.
Just recently, there was a major tragedy in our area in Florida, in Surfside, Florida, which is like 2 minutes from where my son lives.
Mm-hmm.
And the building collapsed. and I think they used the
Search dogs.
Search dogs.
Yeah.
Those would have been air sent live find search dogs who come in the beginning when the disaster first happens. So the first thing they have to do is get those live find canines or air sent canines there to find people that are buried alive, so they know where to go in and get these people out. Those dogs will pick up scent from people literally buried in that debris that are still alive. They won't pick up or indicate on anyone who has passed. It's only live scent they're looking for. And I tell people, when you're out, you see these things happen, thank those people. They're all volunteers.
And we'll get back into it a little bit. But Nancy, I see over your left shoulder a book called Psychic Detective. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about. What is the role of a psychic detective?
Not to be separate, not to make claims, but to work as perhaps we can pull out some information that they either have too many clues or none. And so we vary in what we do over the years. My first case with the police was 1980. I had moved to Bud Lake, New Jersey, and my son and I both took karate, and his teacher was a police officer. And so shortly after I went there, apparently there was some article she read about my work in other ways. And she asked me at the end of the class if I saw anything. There was a recent rape. And before she could finish the sentence, I described a man. She said, "I'd like to tell my superior officer." Fine. So the next week, I'm back at the karate school and I see a guy and he's going, "Psst." And I'm thinking, "You look like Ernie from Sesame Street." So I go over, stand next to him, and he asked me to repeat it. I repeat it. He says, "I'd like to come over tomorrow to your office with my partner." Sure. So they sit down opposite me and they said, "We have a problem with your description." And I'm thinking, well, of course, I don't know what I'm doing. I've never worked with law enforcement. And they said, "Well, there are 2 people answering that description." I said, "No, there aren't. There's just one." And I stood up and limped across the room and then sat down. They said, "How did you know one had a limp?" I said, "I became him." And so they went back to that one, told this one, "We had an eyewitness see you commit it, and he fully confessed to a rape murder."
And take me through that process. And then, Gale, we'll get to you on this too. But Nancy, is this just a gift you were born with? I mean, how did you know about the limp? And what is your process for coming to that sort of conclusion?
Okay, let me take one at a time and say many people are not born with it and can develop it. But it's also, how do you work at a fresh crime scene? Do you have the ability to be calm and centered? So part of my technique, I was born with it. Part of my technique is simple. I have to put everything away, stop all thinking, and be the observer. And I think of it as one detective said when he observed me, he's called it soaking up the scene. So whether I'm there at the scene or whether I'm home on a phone, doesn't matter. I project as if I'm there. We all have processes in getting into that realm. And probably no 2, like Gale and I, no 2 are alike in it. Sometimes I see things, sometimes I hear it, sometimes everything is there, sometimes it's a movie, sometimes it's just a knowing, and sometimes it's like walking into a fresh crime scene and going over to the vacuum in the living room and saying, "He used the cord to tie her up," and it was true. So how do I know that? I don't, we can give you physics and we can give you metaphysics and we can play with it, but nobody really can describe what anybody else does. I've taught thousands of people over 47 years.
Do you have to be at the crime scene?
No.
Or
Said no.
no?
No.
Okay.
She already said
Mama knows. Carmela
Mama.
knows. No, I don't have to be anywhere. I have found missing dogs and stolen stuff and murders over the phone.
Carm, to you, you're the therapist for 40 years. You're a person that reads the human mind for a living. Do you believe in intuition and that people have a supernatural ability?
Wait a second. This is not called intuition. This is something else, right?
I think of it as the fusion of your soul on this earth with your intuition, your thought process, everything. It's mind, body, soul, spirit. So
intuition is part of it.
Sure.
And Carm,
Sure.
I'm a firm believer in intuition.
Yeah.
And here I sound sexist, but I heard that women have better intuition than men. And I saw that over and over again.
Nancy, is that true?
I've worked with both, and I can't say it. I see more women than men, but the men I see are extremely work hard at getting into the right hemisphere and the left together. Well, you know what happens in 5 months in utero, they're flushed with testosterone. And so it's hard for both hemispheres to connect easily unless they practice that. Some can, some don't. But it depends on what you want to do. Joel can be psychic if he wanted. It means practice like anything else, because we may be born psychic. You may be raised in a family like Gale.
Gale, I don't know if you want to add to that, but also can you tell us about one of the very first cases that you worked and how you knew that you could be a psychic detective?
That's funny because one of the first things that I got involved in was I was very young, and I can say this, even though I came from a family that practiced this kind of stuff, that doesn't mean that they were a great help, because they didn't work at this aspect of it. And so they didn't really understand. So when I was a child, the first incident that happened to me was the neighbor and my mother were out in the front yard, as people do, and they were out and they were talking, and us kids were out. And I said, can I run over and play with their kid in their yard, and while the moms are talking, I'm over there playing, and I turned around and looked at their house and saw it on fire. I mean, I'm like 5 years old. I'm freaking out. And I'm running back screaming. Then I turn around, look, the house is on fire, but I'm like telling my mom the house is on fire. And my grandma happened to be in the house. My mother goes, go talk to your grandma. Everything's okay. Go talk to your grandma right now. She basically wanted to shut me up and get me out of there. And so I went in the house and I told my grandma what happened. And she said, honey, we don't talk about these things. I mean, what things? I was confused. What thing? The house was on fire and now it's not. She goes, you don't understand. These things are in our family. We don't talk about them. People don't understand. This is taboo. You're talking about 1960. It's like, no. And I'm like, but, and my grandma's like, we don't talk about these things. This is between our family. We don't let it go further. I'm like, okay, I'm so confused. The next day, their house caught fire.
Wow.
I literally, as a 5-year-old, was riddled with guilt. Mm-hmm. Luckily, everybody got out and was safe, except for their dog, which really set my heart reeling because I love animals. And I thought to myself, and I spoke to my grandmother, and I said, what if I could have warned them? How could it have changed things? What if they would have died in that fire? It would be my fault. That's how I felt. And then I realized I'm on my own path here. I can't have that happen again. That guilt was horrible to feel.
So just to reiterate, this was the day before the actual fire. You're 5 years old. You're playing in the yard and you visualize this. You see it all happening. You see a fire. You go to talk to your grandmother.
Go to her mother, sends her in the house. And it turns out that you were visualizing or seeing something that was about to happen. You said you felt a lot of guilt. Did you feel like you had a gift at that point too?
I did. And I felt that my family in itself, they weren't understanding how I felt because I was seeing things before they happened at that time. And they just kept saying, we don't let this out. This isn't something that you talk about. You should not talk about this. But that's not okay, because if someone lost their life and you could have prevented it, then it's wrong not to talk about it. I mean, in my kid's mind, that made a lot of sense to me. So I went ahead and talked about it, which was totally taboo. And you don't have a lot of friends when you do those things.
Nancy, have you had that experience where you see it well before the actual event occurs? And can you explain, maybe give us a scenario?
Early on, my sister was pregnant, 9th month. She was going to the doctor on a Tuesday. It was Monday morning. When I woke up, I said, oh, because they slept over, she and her husband. I said, you're going to have a baby tomorrow at 12:54 p.m. He'll weigh 7 pounds, 15 ounces, little blonde. And where did he get blonde from? I'm saying. And she said, oh, good, because I had done this many times in many ways. And I think I was 15 at the time, something like that. So ever since I was baby, I would be pointing out things. My sister goes to the doctor. She comes home. She said, I'm so high. And he said, I have weeks to go. Okay. And then Tuesday morning, her water broke. She goes to the hospital. I'm in school at that point. And I'm told that around 12 o'clock, they wanted to give her pain meds. And she looked at the clock and said, no, I got 54 minutes before he comes out. And at that time, they didn't know it was male or female. And so he comes out, but she apparently had told her doctor, because he ran out saying, burn her sister at the stake. She's a witch. Things like that always made me very curious. So knowing things ahead of time, 6th grade, I did a thesis on insane asylums, the history. Then when things happened, I would go do searching the history and whatever else I can find about what prompts behavior in people. And like Gale, I had a lot of those instances. And my mother, I always said, backpedaled all the way, never spoke about it. My father never spoke, so it was easy. But I always questioned, how did these things happen? How do I know beforehand that my best friend at 14 that I played with since I was 6 would be dead next year? How did I know he didn't have a cold? He had something else. I was in medicine. So I've always been curious, more than anything, curious about what this means, because obviously it's all a gift for everybody. It's not a curse, only if you use it with a purpose that is helpful and supportive of life. So being psychic to me means, okay, everybody can be, but how do you use it?
It's interesting. A lot of times I will call my beautiful mother and she will say, I was just picking up the phone to call you. And she says, we must have ESP. What is that when
telepathy?
Can you expand on this?
That's what I say.
Oh, sure. But you know, the closer you are to somebody, particularly if you're mama, I always know when something's going on with my kids. I always know when something's going on with my husband. I always know when my friends are. We could feel it. It's empathy, but it's very strong empathy. And I always say that umbilical cord may have been cut, but the silver cord that lies between the two of you and your heart.
Well, ours hasn't
always
been
there.
We established that.
We're still in the process. So are you what they call an empath, where you have excessive empathy?
Yes. Well, that's why I went into nursing. But I love psychiatry, abnormal psych. And I worked in it for a while. And it was exceptional because I saw things and understood things for the first time about what we think, what we eat, what we breathe. Everything goes into who we are. And we were able to make magic there. Absolutely. And yes, there was a fire there. And 24 hours exactly, same as yours. I knew it was. I thought there was a fire in the room. There wasn't. 24 hours later, there was, and I knew who did it and why. So I was older by that point. I was in my 20s. I was mature. What it always does for me, anyhow, is to make me curious about how wireless the world is. The birds, the trees, everything.
So for full disclosure, her husband, my father, who is 89 years old, is a retired psychiatrist. Psychology and thinking about it runs in the family. Carm, it's your show. No need to raise a hand.
when I was working as a social worker in a clinic, my job was to do intake. Somebody walks in, and I was supposed to write the preliminary evaluation after.
I never knew this in 53 years. I've never known this, but continue.
I won't comment because I won't comment. So
Intake.
I know what that. I would have this whole. Part of it was intuition, part of it was things that I studied and learned about people and the prior experience. And I would come up with these very, almost too easy for me observations. But then thank God, sometimes I was wrong. So it gave me humility. But the initial evaluations that I did were based really on some kind of a mystical part of the whole thing also, because I love them, but I like new cases. I like to hear their stories. I was like into them, really into them. But I don't know if it's even touches on psychic, if it in some way approaches the idea of psychic. I don't say I'm a psychic. And I have to tell you, while you were listening to me, my grandmother and mother had little things of psychics that they were doing in a certain way. They had premonitions and they had impressions and they had certain fears. For example, at that time in Europe, gypsy women would tell tell you, like the psychics, the people who would tell you what to expect next. And one of them predicted that my grandmother would die at 62. And my grandmother and mother were very close. I will not steal the show for you because after this I'll shut up, but I have to tell you this story. So my grandmother and mother were close, and my mother was horrified. By the time my grandmother got to be 60, my mother was living with this fear.
Oh.
And I, as a child, I knew this. I was already a teenager. And I was like trying to be very rational. And I would say, you are just afraid of your shadow. It's not going to happen. The gypsy woman wanted to buy some food, and that's why she did this prediction to you. And then at 62, my grandmother had a stroke. She didn't die, but she had a stroke. So that's the end of that story.
So, Gale, what do you make of that story? Did this woman have intuition and knew that something would happen at this juncture in my great grandmother's life?
I mean, I say there's intuition, definitely, but there's degrees of it. I do believe you can learn it. I do believe you can and continue getting better. But there's also, I kind of look at it, and I've told some of my students, we can all do math, right? Every one of us can grab a checkbook and balance a checkbook and do different things, but we're not all mathematicians. That's a gift in itself. I can speak truly on that because I'm terrible with math. My husband is a mathematician. Me, how much I want to learn, I can get so far, and then I just get frustrated.
I think that's a great point because, that's a really intelligent way of saying it, because as a non-math person, I totally relate, and people have certain strengths, and sometimes you don't know what your strengths are because they come to you very easily. That could be the case. I'm curious, were either your mother or grandmother, as psychics, would they work on criminal cases too, or was that just you?
They totally were on a different end of the spectrum. I did grow up being raised in the spiritualist church, so you did readings on the podium. I started doing readings at 8 years old. And actually, the church would be filled on the days that I was to come in and do readings, and I never quite understood it. But I had a teacher that helped me who was, also at the church. And I really think that she was the catalyst to help me understand my abilities better, because it's a different thing when you're doing readings for people then turning around and working on criminal cases and getting that far into your ability and really grasping what's happening, what you're feeling. And she really coached me through a lot of it because I worked on my first actual case at 16. Hard times fell on my family. We moved into this house and I kept seeing a person in my room in the corner frequently. And I couldn't figure it out. I just started a new school, so I'm trying not to creep people out. Then some kids ran up and said, "Oh, you just moved into the house where this family, their son went missing." And like I found out that I was in the same bedroom that he stayed in. And it was very odd. And I kept getting these feelings and thoughts. And I was never one to have dreams throughout cases. And people say they have dreams. I was not one to have that happen frequently. And I had a dream and I kept seeing the location. And then I would wake up and it's like, even though I'm awake, the dream continues. And I'm watching the things that played out, saw myself there looking while the ones who did it were still there. And it's almost like I was there out of body and then all of a sudden just like slammed back in because I remember gasping, going, "Oh," and I felt the fear. I felt the fear. And I'm like, okay, I don't want that to happen again. I don't like this feeling. So I started finding out that the body still hadn't been found. I actually went with a couple of friends because I didn't drive at the time and I got some older kids that could, and took me to a location in an area where I thought it's what I was seeing. And remember, I just moved to this area of town, so I really wasn't very familiar with the area. I got there and I was able to locate the body. And of course, back then we didn't have cell phones. So you have to go leave the area and call. And I know that he was trying to get me to do it because his family needed to know where he was.
Is this for you? Is this more of a gift or a burden or both?
Well, I'm sure it has its moments of me shaking my head and saying, why do I continue to do this? There's sometimes when I feel so hurt and I feel so much pain from the things that have happened and the heartache, and you see what the families go through yourself. You have felt emotions that, and sometimes you don't want to feel, but it's those very emotions sometimes, if I'm out actually doing an actual search, that takes me to that person. It's like a pull that I can't describe. It's like someone has a rope around me and they're just pulling me right to them. And I've always been one who goes on location and finds them. I've always thought, I've done many from the phone, but I've done many in person and said, listen, if you're going to do it, just go and do it.
The reason this show came about is we had a gentleman on, very well known, named Joseph Scott Morgan, and he's an internationally renowned forensics expert. He works out of Jacksonville State University, which is in Alabama. He has his own podcast called Body Bags. I love that name. Long story short, I think my mother asked him if they've ever used psychics, and he says there were only 2 cases that he could recollect where psychics were used. And in one of those 2 cases, the psychic told investigators where the body was within, I think he said 50 feet or 50 yards of where the body was. And we looked at each other and we were like, whoa, this is...
No, the case that we are discussing these days, I just give you a very short description. There were 4 University of Idaho 21-year-olds, 3 boys and 23 boys and a girl, students at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho, who were stabbed with a knife in the most violent way. And the FBI is involved, the state police is involved, the local police is involved. And it looks like they have not even people of interest. This is when I was thinking, if they're so stuck, I personally am afraid of things that are not completely what I call rational, but I know I'm afraid of them, but I know that they exist. So I asked do they ever use the psychics? Because I saw in some programs and so.
So Nancy, to you, and I'm glad my mother brought it up. Let's say hypothetically you were called to this case in Moscow, Idaho. 4, as my mother said, college students just savagely stabbed to death in the early morning hours of a Sunday night back on December.
Now it's 4.5 weeks.
November 13th, I believe it was. What do you do when you arrive on scene? Walk us through your process of getting to a crime scene.
A lot of times I don't want them taking me to the scene. I want to take them to the scene because I want to be the antenna. I want my antenna very strong. So to give you one that I did, maybe that'll help understand.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Princess Doe in 81 or 80 was the very first missing person child to be put into the afterwards, when the bill came to pass, the Exploited and Missing Children's Bureau. She was the first entry. It was in New Jersey, about 45 minutes from where I lived at the time. I didn't know anything other than Princess Doe was an unidentified body. Didn't know where, didn't know what. But because I knew some sheriff's investigator I worked with on missing children and found them and things of that sort, he asked me if I wanted to come to the task force and meet the prosecutor. And because they didn't have a real police force, they had a captain of homicide prosecutor kind of thing. It was a little weird. But anyhow, I go and I meet Captain David Heater, who was so nice, and all the rest of the task force. And they said, what would you like to do? I said, I want you to put me in the car with you, and I'm going to point you to where I want to go. And they said, fine. And I said, go left, go straight. Oh, pull up to this little strip mall. There's a pizza place, and there's a supermarket right next door. And I said, I've got to get into the pizza place. So they go in with me, and they go to the counter, and they say, what would you like to order? And I said, I don't want to order anything. I know whoever I'm looking for was here and her murderer. And she was in the next place in the supermarket. So that means she was alive then. Okay. And so I'm walking and I'm getting a look. I said, okay, let's go. I want to go about a half a mile up and I want to go to the right. Well, half a mile up to the right is a cemetery. I said, okay, can you take the road in and I'll tell you when to stop. So we take the road in almost to the end. I said, pull out, stop. I go to the ravine right there. And I said, you found her body right there. They said, yes, we did. I said, okay, now I can go back with you and talk because I see him taking either hammer or a big stone to her head so that the parts of her head were crushed. They said, yes. I said, okay, let's go. So we go back to the town, the county or whatever seat. And I said, do you have any kind of evidence? I know she wore something, not clothes because that's in forensics, but you had something else. And they said, yes, a little necklace. I said, may I hold it now that it's been tested? And they said, sure. So I went back, not understanding I am telling you the process is that nothing else is going on in me. Nothing. I trust what comes. I can only say absolute faith. So I sit down and I given a private room I asked for, and I sat there and I imagined I'm talking to her. And I know she's a kind of runaway, not from our state, and she's very upset. So I imagine I have a conversation with her, and she doesn't want to go near who the killer was because it was horrible. And she hints that there were 2 of them and that she had been brutalized, sexually brutalized. I said, okay, got it. So I come back and I said, okay, there's a guy named John, last name begins with an R, single syllable. He's got a scar on his right cheek and a Western belt buckle, because that's all I could see through her murder. I can picture who she's seeing. Take notes. Nothing happened. 0. No one ever identified her then at all for years and years and years, decades. 5 years later, a woman walks in my office and she says, nothing. And I look at her and I said, you just had a horrible, brutal murder of a family member. Your sister? Yes, yesterday, I think it was. So I said, well, here are my references if you want. I cannot tell you anything I see. I have to speak to local people handling it. I'm not telling you. She said, okay. So she goes back and who's calling me? David Heater, Captain David Heater. So I go back out and I go with him to the fresh crime scene. And that's where I see the vacuum and the cord. And I know how she died. I go to the bedroom where she was killed. I walk into everything, and it's in the book, The Life of a Psychic Detective. I walk in, it's a first floor, and then there's an upstairs apartment. And I said, your murderer is upstairs. First name, John. Last name begins with an R. Scar on the right cheek. Western belt buckle, 5 years later. And they said, do you remember ever saying that before? I said, no, but he's a serial killer. Well, go forward. Without going into all the details of that, I described how he killed her, that he killed her with a hammer, that the hammer was put in a swamp. I come back out. The person they thought killed her was her boyfriend. I said, absolutely not. They said, but we polygraphed the guy, John Reese, who lives upstairs. I said, he's the killer. Go back and look at him. But he doesn't have a scar, David said. I said, you're wrong. Go look. So next thing I know, they look, they bring him back in because autopsies back then weren't done yet. And he fully confesses because they now know. They polygraphed him to 11:30, I think, at night, or 12. She was killed after 1. And I kept saying, your polygrapher is wrong. She was killed much later. And so it was all proven out. He fully confessed on video. He just died in October in prison for life. And I'm still very close to the family, all of them.
Wow, fascinating story. Carmela, what do you make of that? I'm curious about your reaction.
I never had images like when I worked with some people that they have these mental images, and I never had them. I think I made a very strong effort as a very young child to push that part of me out.
Are you saying that you're psychic?
Wait a second. One day I was tired. I was lying down and I saw in my literally live, authentic, everything normal, a bunch of people just walking, and they were more real than if I would have seen a bunch of people walking in the street. It was a different street. What I'm saying is that I experienced something what I considered out of the ordinary for myself. It had no other parts to it, but I had a visual thing that wasn't really happening that I saw. I never say, no, it's impossible. No. But I am so hung up on being rational that I don't let it in often.
And Gale, to you on that point, there are people now in the modern world called keyboard warriors. And I know I'm going to get emails, and I know they're going to say, this is insanity. People can't do this. It's just a coincidence. These women are wacky. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I mean, I didn't start out, to be honest with you, what people call, the phone psychic or the keyboard. I have been well known for something that I call the blind drive. So sort of what Nancy spoke about. I will get in and I don't know where I'm going and I don't want to know. And I've actually been on a drive. Someone will say, I'll drive and blindfold you. They actually did in Florida, blindfolded me on a case. A blindfold doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm not using anything visual like they're thinking. So I was, they blindfolded me and I'd say, I feel like I'm coming up to a road on my left, turn left. Okay, I want you to go down about 3 miles. Okay, I'm feeling something, again, turn left. And it takes me right to the spot. I've always been one when I was younger, especially, I still do it though. I want to make sure that I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And if it means doing the drive or doing what I call my blind drive, I'm going to do it. I seem to pick up a lot doing that. And I really feel it's as if the whole thing is playing out almost like a movie in some way as I'm going through. And I don't hear, I've had actually people say, I kept saying your name and talking to you and you're not listening. I'm like, I get in my zone when I'm doing it. It's almost I can't stop. One time I almost walked across a highway. I was with my daughter. At the time she was 16 and she had been working cases on and off with me. And this is one of them that they had on TV that I did. And I sort of remember hearing the phone ring. And this is when first had cell phones. And I just picked and I just literally took it out of my pocket and chucked it. I was like, I didn't want to hear anything. I was in a zone. I was hearing the voice. It was calling me to where he was. I was just feeling everything. And I nearly walked across the highway. And I remember her grabbing me, saying something. And I stopped for a minute. And then she said, go. It's like I was dreaming. I could barely hear her, but I could hear her. And then I just kept going, and she crossed it. And I went to go on one side of this creek, and I go, no, because I kept hearing, no, you're on the wrong side. And I'm going, no, wrong side. She goes, Mom. I remember hearing her go, Mom. And I'm like, no, I got to go this way. And I'm going through this wooded areas, and I'm going through this. And all the while, anything sort of what I would say in the real world was more like a dream. And the world that I was actually in felt more real. It was, I was trying to locate the body. And when I got there, well, actually, just before I got there, my daughter had gone down low. I had a knee problem. She goes, I'll take the lower. I was like, yeah, I will. Like I said, I'm not with it. She goes down lower on the bank of this creek. And I stopped for a brief minute. I actually heard my father's voice, and my father had just passed away. And I heard my father's voice extremely loud and stern. And I heard him say, call her up now. And that kind of pulled me out of what I was going through. And then I yelled for my daughter because I realized that was so serious. And I called her up, and she said, what's wrong? Are you hurt? I said, no. And then I heard, his name was Jesse. I heard his voice again. He goes, walk 15 feet. So I literally took 15 steps. He goes, turn, look down. That's me. And I did. And there he was. If my dad hadn't said to call her up, she would have walked right up on that body. And at 16, I didn't want her to do what I had done.
I can only imagine. I'm curious because you both mentioned you have children. Are you willing to share if your children inherited your gift? Nancy, to you first.
Depends on what age. So my son, I would take to the School of Visual Arts, and one of my friends was a director, a scriptwriter, and I would do some creativity and mind exercises with them and psychic telepathy with them. And my son would be the one who would always get everything right. But he was also very empathetic. So the one time I ever had a headache when he was like 2, he walked right over to me, put his hand right over where the pain was. So I knew that he was sensitive, empathetic, and could feel things about others, can get that energy, right? As he grew older, he became much more questioning, but not so much me, because I taught at his school. I was invited by the math department. I was invited by all of them to do a 6-week program on all things metaphysical. I talk about the pineal gland, the video camera that has optical receptors. It's a literal third eye. I try and take away the mystification for people and say there are certain things about it that are understood, that you can see images, particularly if your pineal gland's working very well. But do you want to see them, as Carmela so clearly pointed? My daughter, on the other hand, is extremely intuitive, incredibly empathetic, and very successful doing what she loves to do. She created a store. She's known since she was 4 what she wanted to do. And so she's always used it to make connections, loving connections with people. And so I think, the psychic world, to me, psychic means soul. That's the root of the word. It's Greek, psyche. And so it actually means soul. So when your soul is present, you know things about the universe, about yourself. You can go deep inside. You can learn. It's all inside, I believe. And yes, we're all wrong at times. We're right a lot of times. That's what makes us stand out, I think, from the crowd, so to speak, that we've done plenty of right. But I'd like to respond to one thing when you talked about the keyboard. If you can educate somebody, and I get lots of requests and I still give readings, but if you can educate somebody who is, that they make the face with their words, right? And if I feel that there is any hope for them, or if they're too frightened, the wall is up. And in therapy, we know all about that too. If they're so shielded, then the roots of their fear go way back and has nothing to do with what I'm doing. So I never project back at them. If I can give them an education on why I never speak about ongoing cases, why when I get dozens of requests to look at every missing child in the world, and I send back and I post about how I took an oath. I had 2 badges. I have 2. That's my real badge on the book. I'm a commissioner for work done. So it's not a game and it's not a curse, and it's no different than honoring the oath, whether you're a nurse or I've been a minister, I am one, and work with the police. So I don't talk about anything except very adjudicated cases, or so old that nobody remembers them.
And Gale, to you, I don't know if you have more than one child, but have they been given the gift that you have? Has it been passed down to a 4th generation now?
They use theirs in a much different way than I use it, but they do have it. My one is, and she knew from the time she was probably 5 or 6 years old. She always said she wanted to be a mental health nurse. I'm like, okay. So, I don't say too much. I kind of let things play out. And what is she today? She is a community mental health nurse. And my oldest one always wanted to be involved with helping people. And she is also a nurse, but she's in administration. I have a son that's a gifted musician, and he plays all over. We won't mention names, but he is quite well known. And he uses his ability in his music. And he always says that he hopes that he speaks to people through his music with his ability.
And my 3-year-old son just said he's going to be a podcaster. We're shocked he knew the word. It's already happening. The next generation will be podcasters.
Because he sees the setup. Because he set up a little studio in his own house, so we don't have to go to the
real studio. So
real studio.
Nancy,
every time we go there regularly every week.
You mentioned, and we'll wrap up with this because I'm making Carmela work double time. We have another show right after you. So can you share a couple of techniques, just simple ones, if people are curious and want to try this?
My favorite technique is, have you ever missed anything, misplaced it, can't find it, right? I want you to think that we're all electromagnetic. You can take EKGs, EEGs, EMGs. We are electromagnetic. So if we focus strongly without fear, without worry, then we can find pretty much anything. As Gale has given you several instances of that, it is turning it into, number one, calm down. You know that old adage, take 3 deep breaths? Take 3 deep breaths. Stop thinking of where did I put it? What did I do? Oh my God. And it's the same thing if your child's home late. I know your heart's is racing. If that ever happens, it's still calm down because you have to find out the truth. So that's number one. And then I tell them all, if you have anybody who will play with you, give them an object of yours and tell them put it somewhere in the home that you live and don't tell you where it is. And then I want you to go room to room and imagine that you are picturing the item and you are a magnet. Do you want to get into the room? Do you want to go to the center and go right, left, and keep your eyes closed if you want? You will go right to the object after you go room to room. Practice. So for me, even though I've always been psychic, I think of it as, do it a few thousand times. You get much better at it. Even if it comes naturally, you want to understand. It's not enough to do it. It's enough to put a purpose to it, like your mother's purpose, like your purpose in telling the world things. There has to be a purpose. So what if I know something? What good is it unless? So missing items are an easy way to go.
Nancy, I need you to train my wife who loses her cell phone and wallet every single day. Carmela, you had a question.
No, I had a question which is probably outside the framework of this. As a therapist, I got used to daring to ask questions. If it's uncomfortable, don't answer. But I wanted to ask you, how do your spouses react to
I was going to ask the same question. I was going to ask the exact same question. That was my final question.
My quick answer, my husband is as psychic as they come. He's a scientist, physicist, chemist, electrical engineer, patent designer, now 81, almost 82. And he is not just open. I think he's too gullible.
It's interesting because
No, wait a minute.
Gail's husband is a mathematician and yours is a physicist and a scientist. Gail, what does your husband think of you?
Actually, when we met, I didn't tell him who I was in the sense of what I did or anything like that when we met. And, unfortunately, the internet, it can be a good or bad thing. And I guess he looked my name up and then said, and so when I kind of met him and we talked for a minute, he goes, "So well, Psychic Gale." I went, "Oh, great. Here we go." Not what I want, but we had great conversation. He said his mother, who at the time was 93, he said growing up, she had always spoke of her gut feelings and she felt like something was going to come or something was going to happen. He said, so it seems only normal to me. He said, I get strange premonitions at times when I shouldn't go down a certain street or I shouldn't do something. He goes, and I learned from my mother to never fight that.
Nice.
And do it. And so that you don't, fall into harm's way. So like he said, I don't understand the extent of what you do or how, but I understand and appreciate because I do have my own feelings and I've had dreams and different things that came true. Fascinating.
Thank you so much. Gale St. John is on the bottom in the red, born in Toledo, Ohio. She has been doing psychic readings for over 35 years, appeared on Geraldo Rivera's show, Larry King's show, Nancy Grace's show. The list goes on. Top of your screen, Nancy Orlen Weber, who has written 2 books, which I'm looking for the title for right now. The Life of a Psychic Detective, which is over her left shoulder, and another book, All Nature Speaks, which is why the squirrels listen to her. Thank you all for joining us, Carm. Great to have you here in person. We'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Love you, America.